Samuel Davis had a love for cooking, something he learned from his grandmother back in Georgia. She would be in the kitchen at dawn, singing to herself as she kneaded dough or stirred pots of stew, filling the house with rich, comforting smells. Samuel was drawn to her, watching her mix ingredients and whisper her secret spices. She taught him more than just recipes. She taught him that cooking was an act of love. It was about sharing a piece of yourself with others, one meal at a time. Years later, Samuel found himself in New York City, a line cook in one of the most prestigious French restaurants in Manhattan, La Belle Maison. It was a hard-earned spot in a high-end restaurant world dominated by people who didn't look like him. Samuel was often the only black chef in the kitchen, and though he tried to ignore the subtle looks and whispered remarks, it was impossible to dismiss the undercurrent of judgment he felt from his colleagues. Most of them saw him as someone who didn't belong, but Samuel kept his head down and focused on his work, determined to prove himself through his dishes. In the kitchen, there was a sous-chef named Eric, a man with sharp, calculating eyes and a penchant for making others feel small. Eric had an ego as high as his position in the kitchen hierarchy, and it didn't take long for him to zero in on Samuel as his preferred target. Every time Samuel cooked a dish, Eric was there, peering over his shoulder, making comments that ranged from dismissive to outright hostile. "Guess they'll let anyone in the kitchen these days," Eric muttered under his breath once, loudly enough for Samuel to hear. Samuel's jaw clenched, but he kept stirring his sauce, ignoring the insult. He learned early in life that reacting to every slight would only give people like Eric the satisfaction of knowing they'd gotten to him. But Eric's behavior only got worse over time. He began assigning Samuel the dirtiest, most grueling tasks in the kitchen, then berating him when he fell behind on his primary duties. One evening, Eric handed Samuel a bucket of potatoes. "Start peeling," he sneered, smirking, "and when you're done with that, you can scrub the floors. Maybe you'll actually be good at something." The entire kitchen fell silent, the other chefs exchanging awkward glances but saying nothing. Samuel took a deep breath, nodded, and set to work on the potatoes without a word. But inside, he felt a simmering anger he struggled to control. It was around midnight. The restaurant had emptied, and the kitchen staff was finally cleaning up. Eric approached Samuel once more. This time a smirk plastered across his face. "So, Samuel," he said, his voice dripping with mockery, "tell me, how does it feel to be in a real kitchen? Not used to cooking at this level, are you?" Samuel straightened, his eyes meeting Eric's. "I know my place," he said quietly, "and I'm not here to compete with anyone. I'm just here to do my job." Eric scoffed. "Yeah, your job, which I'm guessing is what, frying chicken down south? Or cooking up soul food on some street corner?" The laughter that followed felt like knives to Samuel's pride. He clenched his fist but held his ground, saying nothing, even as Eric's words echoed through the kitchen. But Samuel noticed something out of the corner of his eye. A tall, dark-suited man had just entered the kitchen through the back entrance. It was Anton LeClair, the elusive restaurant owner. LeClair rarely made appearances, as he spent most of his time managing his empire from behind the scenes. But tonight, he was here, and he was watching. Eric hadn't noticed LeClair yet, but the silence that fell over the room alerted him. He turned, his smirk faltering as he saw the owner's cold, assessing gaze fixed on him. For a moment, no one spoke, the tension in the room thick enough to slice through. LeClair's voice cut through the silence, smooth yet steely. "Chef Eric," he said, his accent laced with the slightest trace of French, "would you care to explain what you were just saying to Chef Samuel?" Eric stammered, his face flushing red as he fumbled for words. I was only, trying to help him find his footing, sir. I mean, he's new here, and I thought—" His voice trailed off as he looked down, unable to meet LeClair's piercing gaze. LeClair crossed his arms, a look of disdain flickering across his face. "I don't recall authorizing you to humiliate my staff. Chef Samuel was hired here for his talent, not for your entertainment." His voice dropped to a near whisper. "I've never been a fan of bullies, Chef Eric. Consider this your only warning." Eric was speechless, his face a mottled mixture of red and white as he nodded stiffly, mumbling a quick apology. LeClair turned his gaze to Samuel, his expression softening. "Chef Samuel," he said warmly, "I'd like to speak with you privately after your shift. Your work has not gone unnoticed." As LeClair left, a sense of triumph filled Samuel, and the other kitchen staff who'd been silent all night glanced his way with a newfound respect. In the days following LeClair's intervention, Samuel noticed a shift in the kitchen's atmosphere. Eric, cowed by LeClair's reprimand, became quieter, his remarks dulled. Yet Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that the situation was far from over. Eric's resentment simmered just beneath the surface, his glances laced with a quiet fury. One night as Samuel prepped for the evening service, a younger chef approached him, a nervous look on his face. "Samuel, I overheard Eric talking with some of the others. He's saying things about you, not good things." Samuel's heart sank. He'd hoped that LeClair's words would be enough to keep Eric in line. But it was clear now that his troubles in the kitchen were far from over, and he couldn't help but wonder just how far Eric was willing to go. The whispers about Samuel didn't stop. They seemed to spread, reaching every corner of La Belle Maison. Other staff members began treating him differently, their friendliness turning cold, their conversations halting when he entered the room. Samuel did his best to ignore it, staying focused on his work. But the isolation was a heavy burden to bear, and he felt the weight of every suspicious glance and mocking snicker. One evening, Samuel was preparing his signature dish, a rich coq au vin with a southern twist, using a blend of spices that his grandmother had taught him. It was a risky choice, one he'd been working on perfecting, and he'd finally built up the courage to present it to the head chef, hoping it might earn him some recognition. But just as he plated the final dish, Eric appeared beside him, a smug grin on his face. "Coq au vin with a southern twist? Really, Samuel?" Eric scoffed. "It looks like, I don't know, soul food trying to wear fancy clothes. Hardly appropriate for La Belle Maison, don't you think?" Samuel's face burned, but he refused to rise to the bait. "It's a fusion dish, Chef Eric. Just trying to bring a bit of my background into the kitchen," he replied as calmly as he could. Eric leaned in, his voice barely a whisper. "Your background doesn't belong in this kitchen. Maybe there's a place for it on some corner down in Harlem, but not here. Not in a Michelin-starred restaurant." Samuel's heart raced, his hand tightening around the handle of his saucepan. He wanted to defend himself, to tell Eric that his food was just as refined, just as worthy as anything else on the menu. But he held back, swallowing the lump in his throat. Just as Eric was about to walk away, another figure entered the kitchen. Anton LeClair, the restaurant owner, with his usual quiet authority. He had his eye on Samuel's dish, his nose twitching as he took in the aroma. He glanced at Samuel, a small smile lifting the corner of his mouth. "Chef Samuel, may I try this?" LeClair asked, reaching for a fork before Samuel could even respond. Samuel nodded, his heart pounding. He could feel every pair of eyes in the kitchen on him as LeClair took a bite. The room held its breath. Then, to Samuel's immense relief, LeClair's eyes brightened, and he nodded approvingly. "This is exquisite," LeClair murmured, taking another bite. "The flavors are rich, unique. It's an innovation, something I'd like to feature as a special next month." He turned to the head chef, who nodded with an impressed smile. Eric's face twisted with shock, his fist clenched at his sides. He forced a stiff smile as he muttered, "Of course, sir. If that's what you want." LeClair's sharp eyes didn't miss the tension in the room. He turned his gaze to Eric, his expression thoughtful. "Chef Eric, why don't you take the next few nights off to cool down? I think it's time for some new energy in the kitchen." Eric's mouth opened in protest, but he bit back his words, his face flushed with rage as he nodded and left, the tension crackling behind him. The kitchen fell silent for a few moments before someone let out a cheer. Finally, Samuel allowed himself to exhale, relief flooding through him as his colleagues congratulated him. For the first time since he'd started at La Belle Maison, he felt a glimmer of hope. With Eric temporarily gone, Samuel flourished. The head chef gave him more creative freedom, allowing him to bring his grandmother's flavors and techniques into the restaurant's classical French menu. The restaurant's patrons raved about his dishes, calling them inventive and unforgettable. and soon his signature dish became one of the most popular on the menu. But Eric's absence didn't last long. He returned with a forced smile and a hardened demeanor, but the scorn in his eyes was unmistakable. He was no longer overt in his insults. Instead, he worked behind the scenes, planting rumors among the staff, undermining Samuel's authority, and spreading whispers that Samuel had only achieved his position due to diversity quotas and pity. One night, Eric found his opportunity to strike. It was a particularly busy evening, and Samuel had been assigned to oversee a section of the kitchen for the first time. Everything was going smoothly until Eric appeared, hovering near Samuel's station, his eyes scanning every detail with a malicious gleam. "Samuel," Eric said smoothly, "I need to check the wine reduction for table 7. I noticed it wasn't up to standard earlier." Samuel, focused on his work, replied, "I checked it, Chef Eric. It's fine." But Eric insisted, leaning in close to Samuel, his voice sharp. "Check it again, and don't question my judgment." As Samuel turned to examine the sauce, a flurry of movement caught his eye. He watched in horror as Eric reached for the salt and poured a substantial amount into the pan when he thought no one was looking. Samuel's heart sank. Eric was sabotaging the dish, aiming to humiliate him in front of the kitchen and ensure that he would bear the blame. The dish was sent out, and moments later, an irate server rushed back into the kitchen with a complaint from the table. Samuel felt his stomach drop as the head chef strode over, his face a mixture of confusion and disappointment. "This is unacceptable, Samuel," the head chef said, shaking his head. "How could you let this happen?" Eric's smirk was barely concealed, his satisfaction gleaming as he leaned against the counter. "Looks like Chef Samuel isn't quite ready for this responsibility after all," he muttered. Before Samuel could explain, LeClair entered, having heard the commotion. He glanced around the room, his face impassive but his eyes taking in every detail. He noticed the look on Eric's face and Samuel's tense posture. "What happened here?" LeClair's voice cut through the room like a knife. Samuel opened his mouth to explain, but Eric interrupted, putting on a sympathetic tone. "Sir, it appears Samuel made a mistake with the seasoning. It's unfortunate, but sometimes people just aren't prepared for this level." But LeClair wasn't fooled. He looked at the discarded dish, noting the excessive salt with a frown. "Chef Samuel, is this your work?" Samuel hesitated but met LeClair's gaze, his voice steady. "No, sir. I wouldn't ruin a dish like that." LeClair nodded, his eyes narrowing as he turned to Eric. "Chef Eric, would you like to explain how this much salt could have found its way into the dish?" Eric stammered, his face paling. I, I don't know, sir. I mean, maybe it was just a mistake." But LeClair didn't buy it. He stepped closer to Eric, his voice cold and controlled. "I've been watching, Chef Eric. You seem to have a habit of making mistakes around Chef Samuel. But I don't tolerate dishonesty or sabotage in my kitchen." The entire staff was silent, watching as Eric's confidence crumbled under LeClair's scrutiny. "Chef Eric, consider this your last night here. I won't have someone with your attitude damaging this restaurant or my team," LeClair said, his tone final. Eric stumbled backward, his face drained of color. He tried to protest, but LeClair silenced him with a single glance. The man who had once been Samuel's worst enemy was escorted out of the kitchen, leaving the team stunned. In the days leading up to the critic's visit, Samuel poured his soul into perfecting his dishes. Every evening after his shift, he stayed late, refining each recipe with meticulous care. His hands became raw from hours of chopping, stirring, and tasting. His coworkers, who had once only watched from the sidelines, began offering their help. With Eric gone, a sense of camaraderie replaced the toxic atmosphere, and some of the other chefs even apologized for turning a blind eye to his struggles. The night of the critic's visit finally arrived. The restaurant was buzzing with anticipation, the staff tense but determined. Samuel had decided to prepare his grandmother's recipe for oxtail stew, elevated with French techniques he'd honed over the years. It was risky, given the critic's reputation for preferring traditional French cuisine, but Samuel wanted to share something authentic, something that reflected his roots. As he plated the dish, Samuel felt his heart racing. He knew this was his chance to silence every doubt and prove to himself and everyone else that he deserved to be here. When the critic, Charles Boucher, arrived, The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. Known for his harsh, often scathing reviews, Boucher was infamous for being nearly impossible to impress. Dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, he glanced around the dining room with a haughty expression before settling into his seat. The server brought out Samuel's dish and placed it carefully in front of Boucher, who stared down at it, his expression unreadable. Samuel watched from the kitchen, nerves clawing at him, as Boucher lifted his fork and took a bite. The critic's face gave away nothing as he took another bite, then a third, chewing slowly. Samuel felt every second drag on, his heart pounding so loud he could barely hear his thoughts. Finally, Boucher put down his fork, dabbed his mouth with a napkin, and signaled for the server to summon the chef. With a deep breath, Samuel walked out of the kitchen, his palms sweaty as he approached the table. The entire restaurant seemed to have fallen silent, every eye on him as he reached Boucher, who looked up, studying Samuel with an inscrutable expression. For what felt like an eternity, Boucher said nothing. Then he finally spoke, his voice cool and even. "This dish," he began, pausing as if weighing his words, "this is unlike anything I've ever tasted in French cuisine. It is bold. The flavors are unique, powerful." Samuel swallowed, struggling to keep his voice steady. "Thank you, sir. It's a recipe from my grandmother, adapted to the techniques I've learned here. I wanted to bring a bit of my background to the table." Boucher raised an eyebrow. "Yes, I noticed. It is not traditional, certainly. I usually wouldn't expect to find such southern flavors in a place like this." A murmur of anxiety rippled through the room, but Samuel kept his gaze steady, refusing to shrink under Boucher's scrutiny. Boucher's lips pressed together in thought before he continued. "However, tradition is often stale. This dish, it speaks of heritage, of innovation. It is remarkable." His face softened slightly, a hint of approval gleaming in his eyes. "Your grandmother would be proud, Chef Samuel." A wave of relief washed over Samuel, and he couldn't suppress the smile that spread across his face. The applause that followed was almost deafening as the patrons joined in, recognizing the momentousness of Boucher's words. As the days went on, Samuel's career flourished. His signature dishes remained a staple at La Belle Maison, drawing in patrons who marveled at his innovative approach to combining Southern and French cuisine. Word of his talent spread, and soon Samuel was invited to participate in culinary competitions and featured in renowned food magazines. With each accolade, he held on to his grandmother's words, knowing that cooking wasn't just about fame or recognition, but about sharing a piece of himself with each person who tasted his food. Eric's absence had left a gap, but it was quickly filled by new staff who appreciated Samuel's dedication and resilience. Even Anton LeClair, who rarely expressed personal sentiments, stopped by one evening, simply nodding in approval. "You've made this place better, Chef Samuel," he said quietly, a rare warmth in his tone. "And more importantly, you've reminded all of us what this work truly means." Samuel only smiled, grateful for the journey that had brought him here, the trials and triumphs alike. In the end, he'd found a place where he belonged, where his heritage and talent could coexist, unashamed and celebrated. As he closed the restaurant one night, Samuel glanced out at the quiet New York skyline, a deep sense of peace settling over him. He knew his journey wasn't over. There would always be challenges, prejudice, and moments of doubt. But for the first time, he felt prepared to face them, knowing that he'd built something lasting, something that could never be taken away. And in his heart, he carried the spirit of his grandmother's kitchen, a reminder that love and perseverance could transcend even the deepest divides.